Autobiography of Henry Ford, American industrialist. Henry Ford, 30th July 1863 to 7th April 1947, American industrialist who revolutionized factory production with his assembly line methods. Ford spent most of his life making headlines, good, bad, but never indifferent. Celebrated as both a technological genius and a folk hero, Ford was the creative force behind an industry of unprecedented size and wealth that in only a few decades permanently changed the economic and social character of the United States. When young Ford left his father's farm in 1879 for Detroit, only 2 out of 8 Americans lived in cities. When he died at age 83, the population was 5 out of 8. Once Ford realized the tremendous part he and his Model T automobile had played in bringing about this change, he wanted nothing more than to reverse it, or at least to recapture the rural values of his boyhood. Henry Ford then is an apt symbol of the transition from an agricultural to an industrial America. Early life. Henry Ford was one of 8 children of Williams and Mary Ford. He was born on the family farm near Dearborn, Michigan, then a town 8 miles west of Detroit. Abraham Lincoln was president of the 24 states of the Union, and Jefferson Davis was president of the 11 states of the Confederacy. Ford attended a one-room school for 8 years when he was not helping his father with the harvest. At age 16, he walked to Detroit to find work in its machine shops. After 3 years, during which he came in contact with the internal combustion engine for the first time, he returned to the farm where he worked part time for the Westinghouse Engine Company and in spare moments tinkered in a little machine shop he set up. Eventually, he built a small farm locomotive or tractor that used an old mowing machine for its chassis and a home-made steam engine for power. Ford moved back to Detroit 9 years later as a married man. His wife, Clara Bryant, had grown up on a farm not far from Ford's. They were married in 1888, and on November 6, 1893, she gave birth to their only child, Edsel Bryant. A mother A month later, Ford was made chief engineer at the main Detroit Edison Company plant with responsibility for maintaining electric service in the city 24 hours a day. Because he was on call at all times, he had no regular hours and could experiment to his heart's content. He had determined several years before to build a gasoline powered vehicle, and his first working gasoline engine was completed at the end of 1893. By 1896, he had completed his first horseless carriage, the quadricycle, so called because the chassis of the 4 horsepower vehicle was a buggy frame mounted on 4 bicycle wheels. Unlike many other automotive inventors, including Charles Edgar and J. Frank Dewey, Elwood Haynes, Hiram Percy Maxim, and his Detroit acquaintance Charles Brady King, all two of whom had built self-powered vehicles before Ford but who held on to their creations. Ford sold his to finance work on a second vehicle and a third, and so on. During the next 7 years, he had various backers, some of whom in 1899 formed the Detroit Automobile Company, later the Henry Ford Company, but all eventually abandoned him in exasperation because they wanted a passenger car to put on the market, while Ford insisted always on improving whatever model he was working on, saying that it was not ready yet for customers. He built several racing cars during these years, including the 999 racer driven by Barney Oldfield, and set several new speed records. In 1902, he left the Henry Ford Company, which subsequently recognized as the Cadillac Motor Car Company. Finally, in 1903, Ford was ready to market an automobile. The Ford Motor Company was incorporated, this time with a mere $28,000 in cash put up by ordinary citizens, for Ford had, in his previous dealings with Packers, antagonized the wealthiest men in Detroit. The company was a success from the beginning, but just 5 weeks after its incorporation, the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers threatened to put it out of business because Ford was not a licensed manufacturer. He had been denied a license by this group, which aimed at reserving for its members the profits of what was fast becoming a major industry. The basis of their power was control of a patent granted in 1895 to George Baldwin Selden, a patent lawyer of Rochester, New York. The association claimed that the patent applied to all gasoline powered automobiles, along with many rural Midwesterners of his generation. Ford hated industrial combinations and Eastern financial power. Moreover, Ford thought the Sheldon patent preposterous. All invention was a matter of evolution, he said. Yet Sheldon claimed genesis. He was glad to fight, even though the fight pitted the puny Ford Motor Company against an industry worth millions of dollars. The gathering of evidence and actual court hearings took 6 years. Ford lost the original case in 1909. He appealed and won in 1911. His victory had wide implications for the industry, and the fight made Ford a popular hero. I will build a motor car for the great multitude, Ford proclaimed in announcing the birth of the Model T in October 1908. In the 19 years of the Model T's existence, he sold 1 crore 55 lakhs of the cars in the United States, almost 10 lakh more in Canada, and 2 lakh 50,000 in Great Britain, a production total amounting to half the auto output of the world. The motor age arrived owing mostly to Ford's vision of the car as the ordinary man's utility rather than as a rich man's luxury. Once only the rich had traveled freely around the country. Now millions could go wherever they pleased. The Model T was the chief instrument of one of the greatest and most rapid changes in the lives of the common people in history, and it effected this change in less than 2 decades. Farmers were no longer isolated on remote farms. The horse disappeared so rapidly that the transfer of acreage from hay to other crops caused an agricultural revolution. The automobile became the main prop of the American economy and a stimulant to urbanization. Cities spread outward, creating suburbs and housing developments, and to the building of the finest highway system in the world. The remarkable birth rate of Model Ts was made possible by the most advanced production technology yet conceived. After much experimentation by Ford and his engineers, the system that had evolved by 1913 to 14 in Ford's new plant in Highland Park, Michigan, was able to deliver parts sub-assemblies and assemblies themselves built on subsidiary assembly lines with precise timing to a constantly moving main assembly line where a complete chassis was turned out every 93 minutes, an enormous improvement over the 728 minutes formerly required. The minute subdivision of labor and the coordination of a multitude of operations produced huge gains in productivity. In 1914, the Ford Motor Company announced that it would henceforth pay eligible workers a minimum wages of $5 a day compared to an average of $2.34 for the industry, and would reduce the workday from 9 hours to 8, thereby converting the factory to a 3 shift day. Overnight, Ford became a worldwide celebrity. People either praised him as a great humanitarian or excoriated him as a mad socialist. Ford said humanitarianism had nothing to do with it. Previously, profit had been based on paying wages as low as workers would take and pricing cars as high as the traffic would bear. Ford, on the other hand, stressed low pricing. The Model T cost $950 in 1908 and $290 in 1927 in order to capture the widest possible market, and then met the price by volume and efficiency. Ford's success in making the automobile a basic necessity turned out to be put a prelude to a more widespread revolution, the development of mass production techniques, which enabled the company eventually to turn out a Model T every 24 seconds. The frequent reductions in the price of the car, made possible by economies of scale and the payment of a living wage that raised workers above subsistence and made them potential customers for, among other things, automobiles. These innovations changed the very structure of society. Control of the company. During its first 5 years, the Ford Motor Company produced 8 different models, and by 1908 its output was 100 cars a day. The stockholders were ecstatic. Ford was dissatisfied and looked toward turning out 1,000 a day. The stockholders seriously considered court action to stop him from using profits to expand. In 1909, Ford, who owned 58% of the stock, announced that he was only going to make one car in the future, the Model T. The only thing the minority stockholders could do to protect their dividends from his all consuming imagination was to take him to court, which Horace and John Dodge did in 1916. The George brothers, who formerly had supplied chassis to Ford but were now manufacturing their own car while still holding Ford stock, sued Ford for what they claimed was his reckless expansion and for reducing prices of the company's product, thereby diverting money from stockholders' dividends. The court hearings gave Ford a chance to expound his ideas about business. In December 1917, the court ruled in favor of the George Dodges. Ford, as in the Selden case, appealed, but this time he lost. In 1919, the court said that while Ford's sentiments about his employees and customers were nice, a business is for the profit of its stockholders. Ford, irate that a court and a few shareholders whom he likened to parasites would interfere with the management of his company, determined to buy out all the shareholders. He had resigned as president in December 1918 in favor of his son Edsel, and in March 1919 he announced a plan to organize a new company to build cars cheaper than the Model T. When asked what would become of the Ford Motor Company, he said, "Why, I don't know exactly what will become of that. The portion of it that does not belong to me cannot be sold to me, that I know. The Dodgers, somewhat inconsistently having just taken him to court for mismanagement, vowed that he would not be allowed to leave Ford, said that if he was not master of his own company, he would start another. The ruse worked. By July 1919, Ford had bought out all seven minority stockholders. The seven had little to complain about. In addition to being paid nearly $106 million for their stock, they received a court order dividend of 19 crore 1 crore 92 lakh 75,385 plus 15 lakh 36,749 in interest. Ford Motor Company was recognized under a Delaware charter in 1920 with all shares held by Ford and other family members. Never had one man controlled so completely a business enterprise so gigantic. The planning of a huge new plant at River Road, Michigan, had been one of the specific causes of the Dodd suit. What Ford dreamed of was not merely increased capacity but complete self sufficiency. World War One, with its shortages and price increases, demonstrated for him the need to control raw materials, slow moving suppliers, convinced him that he should make his own parts. Wheels, tires, upholstery, and various accessories were purchased from other companies around Detroit. As Ford production increased, these smaller operations had to speed their output. Most of them had to install their own assembly lines. It became impossible to coordinate production and shipment so that each product would arrive at the right place and at the right time. At first, he tried accumulating large inventories to prevent delays or stoppages of the assembly line, but he soon realized that stockpiling wasted capital. Instead, he took up the idea of extending movement to inventories as well as to production. He perceived that his costs in manufacturing began the moment the raw material was separated from the earth and continued until the finished product was delivered to the consumer. The plant he built in River Road embodied his idea of an integrated operation encompassing production, assembly, and transportation. To complete the vertical integration of his empire, he purchased a railroad, acquired control of 16 coal mines, and about 7 lakh 2 lakh 85,000 acres of timberland, built a sawmill, acquired a fleet of Great Lakes freighters to bring one from his Lake Superior mines, and even bought a glass works. The move from Highland Park to the completed River Road plant was accomplished in 1927 at 8 o'clock any morning, just enough ore for the day would arrive on a Ford freighter from Ford mines in Michigan and Minnesota and would be transferred by conveyor to the blast furnaces and transformed into steel with heat supplied by coal from Ford mines in Kentucky. It would continue on through the foundry, molds, and stamping mills, and exactly 28 hours after arrival as ore would emerge as a finished automobile. Similar systems handled lumber for floorboards, rubber for tires, and so on. At the height of its success, the company's holdings stretched from the iron mines of northern Michigan to the jungles of Brazil, and it operated in 33 countries around the globe. Most remarkably, not 1 cent had been borrowed to pay for any of it. It was all built out of profits from the Model T. Later years of Henry Ford, the unprecedented scale of that success, together with Ford's personal success in gaining absolute control of the firm and driving out subordinates with contrary opinions, set the stage for decline. Trusting in what he believed was an unerring instinct for the market, Ford refused to follow other automobile manufacturers in offering such innovative features as conventional gear shifts. He held out for his own planetary gear transmission, hydraulic brakes rather than mechanical ones, 6 and 8 cylinder engines. The Model T had a 4 and choice of color from 1914. Every Model T was painted black. When he was finally convinced that the marketplace had changed and was demanding more than a purely utilitarian vehicle, he shut down his plans for 5 months to retool. In December 1927, he introduced the Model A. The new model enjoyed solid but not spectacular success. Ford's stubbornness had cost him his leadership position in the industry. The Model A was outsold by General Motors, Chevrolet, and Chrysler's Plymouth and was discontinued in 1931. Despite the introduction of the Ford V8 in 1932, by 1936 Ford Motor Company was third in sales in the industry. A similar pattern of authoritarian control and stubbornness marked Ford's attitude toward his workers. The $5 a day that had brought him so much attention in 1914 carried with it for workers the price of often overbearing paternalism. It was moreover no guarantee for the future. In 1929, Ford instituted a $7 a day, but in 1932, as part of the fiscal stringency imposed by falling sales and the Great Depression, that was cut to $4 below prevailing industry wages. Ford freely employed company police, labor spies, and violence in a protracted effort to prevent unionization and continued to do so even after General Motors and Chrysler had come to terms with the United Automobile Workers. When the UAW finally succeeded in organizing Ford workers in 1941, he considered shutting down before he was persuaded to sign a union contract. During the 1920s, under Edsel Ford's nominal presidency, the company diversified by acquiring the Lincoln Motor Company in 1922 and venturing into aviation. At Edsel's death in 1943, Henry Ford resumed the presidency and, in spite of age and infirmity, held it until 1945 when he retired in favor of his grandson Henry Ford II. Henry Ford was a complex personality. Away from the shop floor, he exhibited a variety of enthusiasms and prejudices, and from time to time startling ignorance. His dictum that history is more or less bunk was widely publicized, as was his deficiency in that field revealed during cross examination in his $1 million libel suit against the Chicago Tribune in 1919. A Tribune editorial had called him an ignorant idealist because of his opposition to US involvement in World War I, and while the jury found for Ford, it awarded him only 6 cents. One of Ford's most publicized acts was his chartering of an ocean liner to conduct himself and a party of pacifists to Europe in November 1915 in an attempt to end the war by means of continuous mediation. The so-called peace ship episode was widely ridiculed. In 1918, with the support of Press Woodrow Wilson, Ford ran for a U.S. Senate seat from Michigan. He was narrowly defeated after a campaign of personal attacks by his opponent. In 1918, Ford bought a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and in it published a series of scurrilous attacks on the international Jew, a mythical figure he blamed for financing war. In 1927, he formally retracted his attacks and sold the paper. He gave old-fashioned dances at which capitalist European royalty and company executives were introduced to the polka, the Sir Roger de Coverley, the mazurka, the Virginia reel, and the quadrille. He established small village factories. He built one-room schools in each, in which vocational training was emphasized. He experimented with soybeans for food and durable goods. He sponsored a weekly radio hour on which quaint essays were read to plain folks. He constructed Greenfield Village, a restored rural town, and he built what later was named the Henry Ford Museum and filled it with American artifacts and antiques from the era of his youth when American society was almost wholly agrarian. In short, he was the man who baffled even those who had the opportunity to observe him close at hand, all except James Cousins, Ford's business manager from the founding of the company until his resignation in 1915, which always said, "You cannot analyze genius, and Ford is a genius." Ford died at home in 1947, exactly 100 years after his father had left Ireland for Michigan. His holdings in Ford stock went to the Ford Foundation, which had been set up in 1936 as a means of retaining family control of the firm and which subsequently became the richest private foundation in the world.